December 1941, Wake Island. As Japanese forces overwhelm the tiny American garrison, one aircraft crashes into the Pacific sand, mostly intact. The Japanese quickly secure it, and what happens next would reshape aerial combat doctrine in the Pacific War. This is the story of what Japan really thought when they got their hands on America's frontline carrier fighter, and the shocking conclusions that followed. But before we dive in, if you're interested in untold stories from World War II aviation history, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss our next video. By late 1941, the Grumman F4F Wildcat had earned a complicated reputation. To American pilots, it was less than impressive. Slower than the Zero, worse climb rate, couldn't turn worth a damn. Jimmy Thatch, one of America's best fighter tacticians, openly complained about the Wildcat's inferior performance after battles of Coral Sea and Midway. One pilot assessment from 1942 is brutally honest. The F4F airplane is pitifully inferior in climb, maneuverability, and speed. Pitifully inferior. Those are strong words. The numbers tell the story. The Wildcat's top speed, 331 miles per hour at 21,000 feet. The Zero, same speed, but achieved at a much lower altitude, meaning better performance where it mattered. The Zero could outturn, outclimb, and outrange the tubby American fighter. On paper, this shouldn't have been a contest. The sleek, nimble Zero should have dominated the skies. But here's where things get interesting. December 11th, 1941. During the brutal defense of Wake Island, one F4F Wildcat crash-landed while defending the airfield. Unlike most destroyed aircraft, this one remained largely intact. The Japanese were quick to recognize the opportunity. This wasn't just wreckage, this was intelligence gold. One of the few nearly complete examples of a frontline U.S. Navy fighter to fall into their hands this early in the war. The aircraft was carefully secured and transported back to Japan. There, technical personnel began the painstaking work of repair, using reverse-engineered parts and improvisation to make it flyable again. They repainted it with the Hinomaru, the Japanese Red Sun insignia, and prepared for extensive flight testing. Think about this for a moment. The Japanese had already been fighting Wildcats in combat for weeks. Their pilots had faced them over Wake, over the Philippines, in scattered engagements across the Pacific. They thought they knew this aircraft, but combat observations only tell you so much. Now, they would truly understand what they were up against. The initial test flights confirmed what Japanese pilots already suspected from combat. The Wildcat was indeed slower than their Zero. Check. Inferior climb rate. Check. Heavier overall. Check. Worse turn performance. Check, check, check. But then, they found something else, something that made Japanese engineers sit up and take notice. The Wildcat could take a beating. Test pilots discovered that the American fighter featured self-sealing fuel tanks, technology that the Zero completely lacked. Armor plating surrounded the cockpit. The airframe itself was incredibly robust, built like a tank compared to the lightweight Zero. They fired weapons at test panels. The results were clear. This aircraft could sustain far more structural damage than any Japanese naval fighter in service. Here's what one famous Japanese ace, Saburo Sakai, later said about the Wildcat, and this is crucial. He was impressed with its ruggedness and believed it was only slightly inferior to the Zero in performance. Wait, slightly inferior? This is a Japanese pilot, someone who flew the Zero, saying the Wildcat was only slightly worse? Another Zero pilot, Harada Kaname, recalled, "The only American fighter that I fought against was the Grumman F4F Wildcat, and the performance was probably the same as the Zero fighter." The same. Not vastly inferior, not hopelessly outmatched. The same. But the Japanese engineers discovered something else that caught their attention. The Wildcat's 6 50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns. These weapons were evaluated for kinetic damage, penetration, and impact force. The Japanese found them more reliable and durable than their own armament, with a longer sustained rate of fire before overheating. But there was one thing that made the Japanese pilots laugh: the manual landing gear, operated by a 29-turn hand crank. Japanese assessments called it impractical, particularly under combat conditions, and cited it as a design flaw. Imagine that, in the middle of a dogfight, having to crank your gear up by hand. Here's where the story takes a fascinating turn. The Japanese didn't just test this aircraft out of curiosity. They used these findings to completely revise their tactical doctrine. New guidance was issued to Imperial Japanese naval pilots based directly on the Wildcat's flight trials. The instructions were specific. Avoid prolonged horizontal dogfights with American fighters. Let that sink in. The Japanese, who had the more maneuverable aircraft, were being told to avoid turning fights with the Wildcat. Instead, pilots were instructed to focus on high-speed boom and zoom attacks, exploiting the Zero's superior climb and initial acceleration. Why? Because the captured Wildcat revealed something the Japanese hadn't fully appreciated in combat. This American fighter could dive like a brick. At speeds above 250 miles per hour, the Zero's controls stiffened. By 350 miles per hour, Japanese pilots could barely move the control stick. The Wildcat, it could safely dive at over 400 miles per hour. Moreover, the Wildcat had better high-speed handling and roll rate. In a prolonged fight, especially at higher speeds, the American aircraft had advantages that weren't obvious on a simple spec sheet. The Japanese had learned a crucial lesson. Paper statistics don't tell the whole story. But here's what makes this even more interesting. While the Japanese were learning about the Wildcat, the Americans were learning about the Zero. In July 1942, just months after the Wake Island Wildcat was captured, the Americans recovered a nearly intact Zero from the Aleutian Islands. They flight tested it extensively against every fighter they had. Both sides were studying each other's aircraft. Both sides were learning. But there was a critical difference in how they applied those lessons. American pilots developed new tactics. The famous thatch weave, where two Wildcats would fly in a coordinated defense pattern, exploited the Zero's weaknesses while maximizing the Wildcat's strengths. Boom and zoom attacks, energy fighting, mutual support. The results speak for themselves. In early 1942, at Coral Sea and Midway, the exchange ratio between Zero and Wildcat was roughly even, about 1-to-1. By the end of the Guadalcanal campaign in February of 1943, the Wildcat was shooting down 5.9 Zeros for every loss. By the war's end, nearly 7-to-1 in the Wildcat's favor. An aircraft that was pitifully inferior on paper became one of the most successful fighters of the early Pacific War. But wait, there's another factor that the captured Wildcat analysis revealed, and it's something the Japanese should have paid more attention to. Survivability. American pilots in Wildcats could make mistakes and live to fight another day. The rugged construction, armor, and self-sealing tanks meant that even heavily damaged Wildcats could limp home. Zero pilots? 1 or 2 50 caliber hits in the wrong place, and that unarmored fuel system would turn their aircraft into a fireball. The American training system could recycle experienced pilots back home to train new flyers. The Japanese kept their aces at the front until they died. Once the experienced cadre was decimated at Midway and over Guadalcanal, the average skill of Japanese pilots dropped dramatically. So what happened to that captured Wildcat? By 1943, there were no further documented references to it. It was likely either scrapped or lost in a training accident, a common fate for test aircraft with no access to original spare parts. But its impact lived on in revived Japanese tactical doctrine and in the grudging respect it earned from enemy pilots who flew against it. The Wildcat story reveals something profound about military technology and combat. The best aircraft on paper isn't always the best aircraft in practice. Combat is a system. It's tactics, training, logistics, and doctrine all working together. The Japanese discovered that the Wildcat was far more dangerous than its specifications suggested, not because it could outturn or outclimb the Zero, it couldn't, but because it was built for a different kind of war, a war of attrition, a war where protecting your pilots mattered as much as shooting down the enemy. American pilots called it the Grumman Iron Works, a tribute to its legendary toughness. One Medal of Honor recipient, Joe Foss, shot down 26 enemy aircraft flying Wildcats. He was shot down himself at least 6 times and survived every single time to get back in the cockpit. He later said, "I loved that Grumman F4F Wildcat. I just loved it. It was like a brother to me." The Japanese might have captured one Wildcat on Wake Island, but they never truly captured what made it dangerous: the American industrial philosophy of building aircraft that could take punishment, and the tactical innovation that turned supposed weaknesses into strengths. So the next time someone tells you that the Wildcat was inferior to the Zero, remember this story. Remember that the Japanese themselves learned to respect this tubby little fighter enough to completely change their tactics. And remember that sometimes the most important question isn't which aircraft is faster, but rather, which aircraft will bring me home? What do you think? Were you surprised by Japan's actual assessment of the Wildcat? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into aviation history, check out our next video. I'll link it in the description. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.